With the first 6 hours of the Mr. McMahon DocuSeries coming out on Netflix, there are a lot of quotes to go over from Vince McMahon himself, so let's take a look at the wildest things McMahon said in the DocuSeries. Starting off on the smaller end of the wild things Vince said, he would assert that the public doesn't get his thought process. They don't understand it. He would say in the Mr. McMahon documentary, some would think it might be hypocritical for me to say, okay, I don't hurt someone else. I just do what's best for me. Yet when someone comes after me, I don't think they have the right. Sure, they have the right. What I say a lot of times is totally different than what I think. The public doesn't understand that sometimes. As a businessman, you have to throw things out there. It's not really the way you feel, but it controls the thought process by doing that. This was his mindset when he was up against Ted Turner and Eric Bischoff's WCW and how they were targeting WWE. Vince McMahon has always seemed to thrive in competition, and by the sound of this quote, gets a real kick out of it, and it seems to bring a certain energy out of him that did, of course, lead to product changes with the Attitude Era and better results in ratings. Moving on, we have Vince McMahon's thoughts on The Undertaker and his match against Brock Lesnar from WrestleMania 30, where it's been said that Taker suffered a concussion during the match. McMahon said during the Netflix docuseries, Mark Undertaker wasn't prepared for it. I think he was in some kind of psychological shock. Looking back on it, I don't see where Mark was concussed. Could have happened, but I think Mark just didn't remember any of that because it was so traumatic for him. This is an interesting perspective to have. He doesn't outright deny that a concussion could have taken place, he just didn't see a point of impact where Undertaker was concussed and is chalking this up to, well, it's traumatic for Taker because of his performance and potentially the streak coming to an end. That's to be presumed and speculated upon because he doesn't go too much in depth on it from here. Now, if we go back to a quote from The Undertaker, this is an article from The Sun dated September 23rd, 2022, where Taker is talking about the match against Lesnar from WrestleMania 30. He says, I'm not sure when I got concussed. I don't know how that match happened. I have no recollection of any of that. My last memory of that day was at 3:30 in the afternoon. I was gone, man. What I think happened was between getting older and then not having all the reps and taking all the bumps through the course of the year, eventually it caught up with me. That explains what happened in New Orleans. That's why the concussion happened. It's one concussion in one match. It destroyed my confidence. I don't even think anybody even knew, really. Undertaker's wife, Michelle McCool, is quoted as saying he was so severely concussed that he had no idea of his name. He didn't know where we were. He didn't know why we were in New Orleans. He didn't know his name until 4 a.m. These are obviously signs of a severe concussion, and it's interesting that Vince is once again amounting this to a poor performance, trauma, and making it seem like, oh, Taker just wants to forget about it. Vince would also briefly speak about retiring from WWE. He said this, do I ever see myself retiring? No, I don't ever see myself ever retiring. I never understood why people stop growing. When you stop growing, you die. Some people are like, I want to retire one day. What are you going to do when you retire? I have no sympathy for people like that, so go die. Now, this should not surprise you if you've heard any stories about Vince McMahon from those that are in the creative room with him or those that work around him or are very close to him. He is a workaholic, is always the first to show up, the last to leave, barely sleeps. When he goes on vacations, he would take writers with him. He was always thinking about how to better his business, how to better the product. He could not sit still. He had an almost obsessive mind when it came to his business, the WWE, and how he was going to continue developing it regardless of the setting or the situation. So this should come as not much of a shock to anyone, but it does open open up to questions like, what is Vince McMahon going to do, let's say, if he was to somehow clear his name to some degree? Is he going to get back into professional wrestling? Is he going to get back into the XFL? What is he going to do in an outside venture from pro wrestling or from WWE? What is next for Vince McMahon? That's the real question that comes from this quote, because we know he doesn't want to retire. Then Vince McMahon would talk about the late Owen Hart. He would first dismiss claims of humiliating Owen Hart. At the time, he had the gimmick in 1999 of the blue blazer Owen Hart did. Vince McMahon said, after the problems I had with Bret Hart, I met with Owen Hart and I said, do you want to stay with us or do you want to leave with Bret? He said, well, I'd like to stay. Bret Hart would say, when I went to WCW and Owen stayed, nothing was the same anymore. He thought I was mad at him. If anything, I had great sympathy for Owen and felt badly that he was in the predicament that he was in. Owen had nothing to do with either me or Vince, but you know, he was gonna pay for it. They kind of humiliated his character as often as they could for quite a while to get at me. Vince McMahon would then address the claim that he tried to bury Owen Hart or make him look like a fool on television. He said, the hypothesis that we would do something against Owen because Bret left only speaks to Bret's ego. Really, Bret? You know, why would we do that? We don't care about you. You left. We're trying to make Owen a star. This was a time during the Attitude Era where the writing style was changing. The programming was getting more cartoonish and raunchy. Owen could have simply been caught up in all of this, but you have to at least take into consideration that maybe they are trying to get back at Bret and stick it to him in some way. That can't be totally unaccounted for. That has to be taken into consideration when thinking about this. Moving on, he would then defend continuing the Over the Edge pay-per-view in 1999 where Owen Hart fell to his death from the rafters. The show would go on. There was a lot of criticism over this decision that Vince McMahon made. Vince said this about it. Owen was to fly, so to speak, as we've done before, from the rafters of the building. Thank God for the audience that we were in a blackout, so they didn't really see it. Thank God. When the lights came up, they saw Owen in the ring and medical personnel were working on him. We wondered whether or not could Owen be alive. Truly, he could be. The decision that basically I had to make after finding out Owen had been pronounced dead was whether or not the show goes on. The live audience didn't really see what happened. Had they seen, there's no question about it, you have to shut the show down. Those people came to see a show. They didn't come to see somebody die. And me as a businessman, it's like, okay, let's continue on. Let's continue the show. There were a lot of negative comments actually as to whether or not the show should have continued. Naturally, Bret's gonna feel like a brother should. He had every right to say anything negative about our company. Had it been me, not just my son, had it been me who was splattered on the mat, as Bret said, I would want the show to go on. Get me out of there and let the show go on. I'd do it with me. To this day, I would. In terms of Owen, we settled a lawsuit basically with his wife, and then we find out, which we thought all along, it wasn't our fault. Unfortunately, the apparatus they were using was defective, and the manufacturer knew it was defective, and then we sued the manufacturer. Now, this is a perspective I can't recall ever hearing. Vince brings up the audience didn't see him fall, therefore didn't know he had fell and died. It was a blackout, and then they see him in the ring. They knew he was seriously hurt and that this probably was not a part of the show, but that's an interesting perspective to have on it. And you can also see that he quickly glosses over the, well, if it was my son, oh, if it was me, I'd want it to continue. We could all figure that if Vince was the one that died, of course Vince is going to say, oh yeah, let the show continue. But you have to think, if Shane McMahon died in the middle of the ring, Vince would probably stop the show. It's up for debate to this day whether the show should have gone on and how it should have been handled. Vince McMahon would also talk about the late Chris Benoit and the tragic double murder-suicide involving Benoit, his wife, and his son. He killed both of them, obviously, and then committed suicide in 2007. McMahon would say this about claims that steroids may have contributed to Benoit's behavior. Chris Benoit was thought of as an excellent in-ring performer, and as far as we knew, a great guy. There is no correlation between taking steroids and what happened to Chris Benoit. Human beings are flawed. Chris went nuts. It happens in every form of life and everything, so that's the only thing I can take away from it. Then on the topic of CTE, he said, this doctor came up with this ridiculous statement of, okay, here's why Chris Benoit did this, some sort of trauma to his head. That's a complete work. It looks like there's damage and there's not. We know what we're doing. We don't hurt each other. Now, the idea that steroids are solely responsible for Chris Benoit doing what he did is a bit of a ridiculous notion. To say it didn't contribute to it would be very dismissive as well. You have to take that into account when you're looking at this, but obviously you had the death of his very good friend Eddie Guerrero. That caused a lot of trauma for Chris. He was very religious, wanting to see Eddie in heaven again. There was also alcohol at the house, and yes, of course, whenever you increase testosterone levels, you can see more anger as a side effect for patients that are on that. And he was more than likely on his fair share. And then you have to, of course, include head trauma into this. No one is saying that in professional wrestling they intentionally hurt each other, but that is a byproduct of professional wrestling. You are going to get hurt. Maybe he's just looking to protect the business and protect WWE here by spinning this in that way, but it's very odd to see him dismiss these ideas from something that happened in 2007. Arguably the craziest thing that was said about Vince was said by Paul Heyman. He relayed this story in the DocuSeries saying, Shane McMahon had an idea that he really believed in and Vince totally disagreed with it. And with most things that happen with Vince, once they start to escalate, they escalate really fast. Vince finally turned to Shane and he said, not while I'm alive. And Vince, who was eating something, took his knife and handed it to Shane and he says, right there, points to his heart, if you want this so bad, stick the dagger right here, because that's what you're gonna have to do to make that decision. And if you don't stick the dagger right here, then I know you're not man enough to do it, and I have to take that into consideration as well. Or you can buy me out the way I bought out my father. And if I don't get out of your way, be prepared to get rid of me the way I would have had to get rid of my father when he wasn't doing things my way at all. And these were some of the wild things Vince McMahon said in the first 6 hours of the Mr. McMahon Netflix docu-series. I hope you're all having a great day. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see y'all later.